look at civilization from a polymathic point of view, this scale is not hard to see. This is what you get. If you study history over and over, you see how these things, for example, in studying the Old Testament, they had the religion and then the law came from the Torah. Jewish law came from their religion. The Jews were different from most people in their day in that they were much more literate. So they had culture. You can see this developing in bits and pieces. And I'm the person who said, if you connect all these bits and pieces, we can see this rung of the ladder here, we can see that rung of the ladder there. If you put all these rungs together, we get this scale. And to me, all the scales seem patently obvious in the same way that the three laws of motion that Newton gave us seem patently obvious to every physicist. Hello, Peter.
Jim, hi. Let's get into the scale of civilization. My gosh, I got so much from this. I think when you critically examine the tensions and the order and sequence with each level and explore the ways that one can promote constructive integration, Western societies can really strive to create a much more sustainable, equitable, and cultural or vibrant future by studying this scale. I appreciate there are nuances within each level. There is the order and sequence you outline in the chapter that every civilization goes through this sequence. But there's obviously the nuances as well in history. So I'm really excited to discuss this with you and get your insights and your valuable teachings on it.
So we're talking about the scale of civilization from Septemex. First, I need to clarify, some people conflate civilization with society, and that is incorrect because a society could be civilized, barbaric, or primitive. So we're not talking about the lower forms of societies, we're talking about civilization. In that regard, I would say there is no Earth civilization. There is pockets of civilization within Earth, but Earth is definitely not a civilized planet. Most countries are not civilized. Certainly, there may be some countries that are civilized that I don't know about because the world is changing all the time and it's hard for me to keep up with the whole world. But certainly none of the big ones are civilized. They're barbaric. If you look at what's going on in UK for the past month and going on in the United States for the past 8 years, it's barbaric. That means it's not civilized. This is how civilizations develop. These 7 levels, I'm not saying that is the only way these 7 phenomena can appear, because they appear in primitive societies and barbaric societies. This is about how a civilization develops. There was a time when the United States was civilized, and this applied to it. But more broadly, this is similar to, in some sense, Oswald Spengler's speculations on the cycles of empires. This is a similar approach. So this is a linear scale, meaning there's gradations between these levels. And in fact, what you generally find is that if you evaluate a country or any other society, whether it's a country or not, you'll find it's in between most of the time because it's complicated. How many different factions are there in the United States, UK, or the European Union? All right, thousands of factions. Some of them are civilized and some of them are not. We scholars have a cumulative and comprehensive understanding of the Roman Empire as a unit. The Roman Empire was very complex, vast, and are all these subcultures. One of the reasons they were successful is that the Romans did not micromanage the countries they made part of their civilization. They pretty much left the people alone. It really was a kind of a federation. As long as you pay your taxes and you don't hurt our citizens, you can do what you want. For example, you have the Islamic zealots who are trying to bring the whole world under a single Islamic caliphate. Romans never intended to do anything vaguely like that. And that's part of the reason why they succeeded. What was going on in Judea was very different from what was going on in Turkey, for example. And that was okay with them. You pay taxes and you obey Roman law to the extent that it applies, and they were fine. The Romans would come in and take care of serious threats like pirates. They would either kill them, or if they captured them, they would crucify them, because the Mediterranean belonged to the Romans and they couldn't have that. There were only three categories of people that the Romans crucified. Most people don't know that. Ordinary criminals were more often executed in an archery gallery. They would tie them to a post and shoot them with arrows. You're dead in about 3 seconds. Anyway, this is a gradual scale. Now, as far as linear, I misspoke on linear. Linear means it's not a spiral scale. There's no apparent congruence between level 1 and 7. Gradual means it's not quantum, doesn't jump, it morphs. And general meaning, for a given unit of society, there is a level, and when you find it, you're done. It's not context-driven. Now, you can say, isn't using it on China and then using it on the United States, isn't that context-driven? Yeah, you could argue with that. When I talk about context-driven, the specific scales must have a context. In other words, what are we talking about? Like the scale of motivation. Whose motivation? Oh, my wife's motivation. See, that's very specific. That's called a specific scale. It's not general. So this is a general scale. You find, if you want to analyze any society according to the scale, once you're done with that frame of reference, that's it. It's not context-driven. So this is a large scale. This is a sort of a Cecil B. DeMille with a cast of thousands production. So you start with number one, philosophy, which is essentially reason. Philosophy means love of wisdom, and philosophers reason things. That is the beginning of civilization. When you have smart men like Socrates, Pythagoras, and Plato who think about things in a serious way by reason, not by belief, by reason. That's philosophy. Those of us who have studied the Western tradition go back to ancient Greece, and you have your pre-Socratic philosophy and post-Socratic philosophy. And most people know when you talk about ancient Greece, you're talking about philosophy. That's what we mostly pay attention to. Of course, it has its history and its culture and everything else. But the big thing is the philosophers. Aristotle was literally called the philosopher for a couple of thousand years.
They grappled with fundamental questions about the nature of reality, knowledge, wisdom, the human condition, and
yes,
their philosophical breakthroughs and shifts in worldviews, as I've researched it, has influenced the trajectory of civilization throughout history.
Certainly, that's why I bring them up so often when people ask me, what are you about? What are you interested in? First thing out of my mouth is the Greek philosophers who, I studied philosophy enough that it seriously altered the way I think about things.
Can you outline and explain the axis as well?
Okay, sure. So when you make a scale, a septemic scale, the question that the author had is, what are we measuring here? Anytime you have a scale, you have to know what you're measuring. And the analogy I always use is, if you have just a piece of wood, that doesn't tell you anything. But when you mark it in inches, now you have a scale. You can measure. You say, yes, this is 16 and a half inches long. If it's a meter stick and you mark it in centimeters, that's a different way of measuring it. So that was a central concern of mine in creating this subject. What are we measuring? What we're measuring here is, at the top is spirituality and conceptualism, and at the bottom is solidity and materialism. Now, obviously, spirituality is the opposite of solidity, and conceptualism is the opposite of materialism. So that's what you got when you study any philosopher, any true philosopher, whether it's Kierkegaard or Thomas Aquinas, any of them. They're very much about spirituality and conceptualism. It's about ideas. And spirituality, as opposed to religion, is about ideas. Now, notice that I have spirituality and conceptualism above level 1 and solidity and materialism below level 7. So humans can never attain an absolute. There is an infinitude of spirituality. If you're at an infinitude of spirituality, you're not a human. You're in some other realm. So that's why it's above and below. Even at the lowest level, so people at level 7 are very solid and materialistic, but they're not infinitely solid or materialistic. There's shades of gray. So that's the axis. When I was going from having the scales, which I had 32 scales in 1995, to actually creating septemics, determining the axis, or you might say inferring the axis, was the main task that I had to conquer in order to make this a workable philosophic subject. Because you know exactly what we're talking about when I give you the axis. At level 1, it's mostly about spirituality and conceptualism. And if you study any of the philosophers, that's what you get. When you get down to 7, business, it's about solidity and materialism. You go to these people who are money motivated, who spend their whole lives getting rich, and you say, what about Aristotle? And they say, don't bother me. They just want to know what stock is going to go up and when, or when they should unload their T-bills. So that's solid and materialistic. Now, I'm not casting aspersions. I'm just saying that's what it is. If you deal with these people, they're not terribly spiritual and not terribly conceptual. They're about money. That's the bottom of society. Now you can say money, that's a pretty advanced thing. Yes. So civilization is an advanced thing. The lowest rung of it is business and commerce, which is still something that you don't find really in primitive societies. And you don't find much in barbaric societies. You notice as the American civilization collapses, and in case you haven't noticed, that's what's going on. It's more heavily concentrated at the bottom of the scale. America, and I can remember in my youth, is much more solid and materialistic than it used to be.
The emergence of organized economic systems, trade and commerce and financial institutions, facilitated the exchange of goods and services as seen in the rise of ancient empires like the Silk Road, as an example.
Exactly. So let's go through this. Once you have philosophy, you have smart men reasoning about the nature of reality, spirituality, and working in concepts. Then the next thing that happens is religion. The philosophy gives birth to a religion. I'm a serious student of Jesus of Nazareth. I think of him as a philosopher. He went around teaching people his philosophy, and then people made a religion out of it. Religion is a little bit more solid, a little bit more materialistic than philosophy. Philosophers are notoriously non-materialistic. Socrates, the most significant philosopher of ancient Greece, lived in a barrel, literally. He didn't care. Now, you notice when you go to church, they pass the plate, right? Whatever religion we're talking about, they always need money. For example, it is a well-known fact, for anybody who's paying attention to this, that the Catholic Church in both the United States and Italy, and when I say Italy, I include Sicily, has been interfacing with the mafia for at least 100 years, probably more than that. Because when the local diocese or pastor needs a new roof for the church, that's a big expense. He goes to the local Don. He says, Don Carlo, we need $50,000 for a new roof. He says, all right, here's a check. And he writes out a check. I happen to know, having grown up in New York, when both the church and the mafia were prominent, that's what went on. In fact, one of the rules in the mafia was that you never touched the church. You didn't touch their possessions. You didn't touch their people. You left them alone. They were protected. They were a protected class. So religion is a little bit more solid. Religion comes from Latin religare, which means to bind back. Philosophers don't want to be bound back. They want to be free thinkers. That's how they come up with their ideas. If Aristotle had been bound back, he wouldn't have come up with the golden mean, which is absolute genius. When you go from reason to belief, now you're in religion. Religion is about belief. Belief is only necessary when knowledge is absent. I don't believe that the acceleration of gravity near the surface of the Earth is 10 meters per second. That is not a belief. I know that. It is a fact. It is a fact that has been verified many thousands of times and anybody can prove. Okay? Has nothing to do with belief. Engineers eschew belief. We do not operate on belief. We operate on facts and calculations. So we take a measurement, run calculations, and discern how this needs to be constructed. 100 ohms is not enough. We need 150 ohms. It's calculated. And ohms are a known phenomenon. It has nothing to do with belief. Okay, resistance is a phenomena.
I want to point out at this level, the rise of all major religions like Buddhism and Jainism and Hinduism and Christianity, they've shaped the values, ethics, and social structures of cultures. But as well as that, the different belief systems have impacted the stability and progression of societies through conflict and interactions of these beliefs.
The two sects of Islam still fighting one another. The Iraq-Iran war, that's a religious war. Or the 30 Years' War in Europe, where they fought to a standstill between the Protestants and the Catholics. They fought until there were no more soldiers left, no more horses, no more munitions. They had to stop because there was nothing left to fight with. If they had more guns and more spears and more wagons, they would have kept fighting. But they ran out after 30 years. That's why it's called the 30 Years' War. So that is what you get from belief. If a person has a belief, good luck trying to change it. It's not based on reason. It's not based on facts. It's a belief. We talk to Christians, they'll say, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. There is no real evidence to support that. There are no facts. Yes, there's a book, but anybody can write a book.
How would you distinguish between belief and faith?
I wouldn't. If you look them up in the thesaurus, Roget's thesaurus, the synonyms. For example, before we had computers, we had slide rules. All of us engineers in those days were whizzes with slide rules. I had no faith in my slide rule. I knew that it was a logarithmic scale and I knew how to calculate with it. There's no faith involved in that. It's not the magic slide rule is going to tell us how many pounds of force we should put here. No, I know it's just a logarithmic scale carefully laid out. By adding logarithms, you can do multiplication. It's done very quickly and easily, and we all used it. If you look at photographs of engineers prior to about 1980, they're all showed with slide rules. Robert Heinlein was an engineer, okay? There's a promotional photograph of him with his slide rule. That's how we took photographs in those days. Like, see John Lennon, he's got a guitar. Robert Heinlein has got a slide rule. Okay. So it's nothing to do with faith or belief. Then once you have religion, you have this structure and you have belief, then you have law. This is very easy to see if you read the Old Testament. Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments. A commandment is a synonym of law. A law is a commandment, right? And from that, you get a moral code. So law and morals are the same thing. Now, a lot of people get mixed up with ethics and morals because it's defined poorly in most dictionaries. It's circularly defined. Ethics is a sub-study of philosophy. It requires reason. Morals is basically a set of rules. The 10 Commandments is a moral code. Now, I'm not knocking it. It's a moral code to which I subscribe. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I follow it within the limits of my sophisticated understanding of life, which is different from most people's. Law and morals is essentially the same thing. You get law from religion because in order to have law, you have to have belief. For example, in Islamic cultures, they think it's perfectly okay for the husband to beat the wife. Women are considered possessions, and it's been that way for 1,300 years. That's their belief. Now, in the United States and in the UK and most of Europe, we don't believe that. We reject that. No, this is a sovereign person who has as much right to live and make choices as men do. It's a different belief. So we have different laws. You punch your wife, you go to jail. For thousands of years, it was considered acceptable in many cultures, in most cultures, for the husband to physically discipline the wife, just as it was considered acceptable to physically discipline children. When I was going to private schools, there was a lot of corporal punishment to the point where people were injured. They drew blood. Nobody complained about it. Nobody filed a lawsuit. They thought that's how you do it. So obviously that's changing in the United States now. I saw hundreds of incidents in school that today would have resulted in the faculty member being criminally prosecuted, going to jail for assault, battery, and so forth. In fact, I went to a very strict school where the philosophy was hit first and ask questions later. Smack the guy around and say, okay, now tell me what happened. Once you have law, then you get the social sciences. The social sciences can only exist after you have law. In other words, you have all these agreements. You can do this and you can't do that. Okay, so in the United States, for about 12 years, you couldn't sell, transport, or manufacture. I'm not sure if manufacture was involved, but liquor was outlawed. It wasn't actually against the law to drink liquor. I don't know if you know that. Drinking it was not a crime, but they tried to wipe out the distilleries. So the distilleries just were taken over by organized crime.
Bootlegging.
Yeah, that's how the mafia became rich and powerful in the United States. Because of that, they made a fortune. The truth was that there were millions and millions of people, perhaps a majority in the United States, who wanted to drink. They wanted their beer, wine, and whiskey. This included clergy, educated people, rich people, smart people. So it just became a black market. And that's what always happens. We make things illegal. Drugs are illegal, there's a black market. So the cartels are making billions and billions of dollars, which they're using to buy American politicians to get what they want. Carrie Lake was running for governor. She said, on my first day in office, I will put the National Guard on the border. The cartels came in, they bribed the election officials and the judges, and Carrie Lake was ahead by 11 points, which is a lot in politics, a week before, and loses the election by a hair. Meanwhile, her opponent didn't even debate her. Why her opponent didn't debate her? Because she knew the fix was in. Why should I debate this person? I'm going to win anyway. A large majority of people in Arizona know all about this. I've been here for 9 years. Just go around, talk to people. Say, oh, yeah, it was fixed. So you get the social sciences, which is about culture. Things like psychology, sociology, the many social economics burgeon after you have law. So you get culture. Culture comes after law. If you study history, this is very clear. The government would come in, always started out as basically soldiers. An army would come in and say, King was in charge and we are his soldiers, and if you bother us, we kill you. These are our rules. You have to pay us so much in taxes and so forth. And once that was established, you saw social sciences proliferating. So now you have culture. You don't merely have morals, you have culture. So the morals embedded in people is culture. The culture comes from morals. So then, once you have that, the next thing is the arts. People become artistic. You have music and poetry and dance, aesthetics. So culture gives rise to aesthetics. Now think about it this way. Aesthetics basically is the consideration of what's beautiful or not beautiful. It's a philosophic subject. The culture largely determines what's beautiful. For example, many years ago, in many of these older cultures, if the wife mouthed off to the husband, he smacked her around. He said, shut up. Now, that's considered horrific, okay? They go right in and arrest that guy. So there is an aesthetic there where you have an idea that being cruel to the wife is now considered ugly. Most people think drugs are terrible, they should be illegal, I don't want my children taking them, etc. If you talk to the people who take the drugs, they say it's beautiful. Arts and aesthetics come and go together. So you have to realize that culture facilitates aesthetics. Can't have aesthetics before you have culture. Then the next thing down is you get crafts or anything that involves using some kind of technology. The shoemaker, the dressmaker, vintner. Now, of course, in modern society, that's what engineering is all about. Engineering is all about technology. We make things. We make cell phones and television sets and jets and things. So that's all craft. And it really serves aesthetics. We think it's perfectly okay to borrow money on your credit card and go on vacation. Now, in order to go on that vacation, you're going to drive a car, or you're going to get in an airplane, or you're going to get in a ship, right? You're using technology. And then while you're on your vacation, you have your cell phone in your pocket. So the fact that we think it's okay to do that, see, that is really an aesthetic consideration. Because 60 years ago in the United States, that was not true. 90% of the people in the United States, even if they could borrow the money, would never borrow money to go on vacation. They would save up their money. They would put away $5 a week until they had enough to go on vacation. See, that was considered ugly, shameful. So similarly now, the internet is overwhelmed with pictures of naked women. I can't get rid of them. I don't know how these people get my email address. It's on my website, and I know thousands of people. They keep sending me pictures, and I just block them and delete. But 60 years ago, that was absolutely verboten in the United States. We had no internet.
It was Hustler and Playboy magazine.
Playboy was revolutionary in the 50s, and Hustler came later. After you got into the 60s and society was degrading more, then you got Hustler. If you've ever looked at those old Playboy magazines, they were nowhere near as vulgar as what you see commonly now. There were parts they didn't show most of the time. So now there are no parts they don't show. So, this is a sign of a collapsing civilization. So you have these crafts, which includes technology, which includes scientists, engineers, designers, and technicians. And once you have crafts, then you have business. So you have some guy in, let's say, ancient Syria, 3,000 years ago, and he figured out how to make sandals, and he makes good sandals. So his family and friends say, oh, look at what nice sandals this guy makes. He said, I'll trade you a bushel of apples for a pair of your sandals. And now we have business. That's commerce. Okay? That's primitive commerce. So even 3,000 years ago, they had coinage, although most people didn't really have much money. Most of the people lived without ever seeing any money. But the people who had it would say, okay, here's a piece of silver, and you give me this sandal. So this guy becomes Zora the sandal maker, and he's got a business going. So he is no longer involved in the day-to-day life that humans have been involved in for thousands of years. He's not a farmer or a rancher anymore. He's not tending his flocks. He makes more money making sandals than he's ever going to make from being a shepherd. So he takes some of this money and he hires some kid. I'll give you room and board and you take care of my sheep. Okay, and the kid has a place to stay rather than starving to death and sleeping on dirt. So that's business, that's commerce. So you have to realize that you've now gotten down to solidity and materialism, and that is what you get from these people. You might have some catastrophe happen in your life. Your son gets kidnapped, or your wife gets some horrible disease and you need money, right? And you go to a relative and you say, look, I have to have some money to hire detectives to find my son, or to treat my wife with this new treatment that's very expensive, right? And the guy says, do you have any collateral to put up if I loan you this money? See, that's materialistic. Now, when I was a youth, if you went to your father and said, I want to buy this house, can you loan me $5,000? He said, I'll have it for you tomorrow. No paper was signed. It's not materialistic. It's family. Now, the United States is, to the chagrin of most people, a distinctly materialistic place, which means it's very solid. If you pay attention, this is a daily occurrence. Somebody has an accident or gets some disease. Okay. As a result of that, he can't work, he loses his job. As a result, he can't pay his insurance premium, he loses health insurance. Now, as a result of that, no job, he gets evicted from his apartment. Now you've got somebody, 6 months later, he's a homeless person, all as a result of an accident or an illness. Goes on every day. These people are solid. I don't know if you've ever spoken to insurance companies. I had an insurance company that refused to pay me. I sued them, and eventually they paid me because I had more than enough evidence to win the case. This went on for 2 years. I discussed this with many people because people hate insurance companies. I don't know anybody who does not hate insurance companies. They're in the same category with drug dealers. They've screwed so many people the way they screwed me. My house was wrecked in a storm. I had all this damage. I complied completely. I had photographs of everything. I had experts write analyses. They just wouldn't pay. I had to take them to court. Now, I can tell you, as a mature person, I've used insurance for many years. Even 10 years ago, it wasn't this bad. I've negotiated with insurance companies to say, you had this accident, we've been paying you, but we can't pay you forever. There has to be a point where you are cured. You negotiate with them, and they say, okay, we'll give you $10,000 and that's it. You sign a release. If the people who stiffed me recently are like that, they would have given me my money. They would have looked at my 75 photographs. They would have looked at the sworn declarations from eyewitnesses, and they would have said, this is a legit guy. We have no way to win against him in court. Here's your money. Instead of doing that, they wound up dropping, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 grand on a lawyer and still had to pay, which is stupid. That's solid. It's like the person's head is made of wood.
What would you say are the potential tensions and imbalances that arise when a civilization places a disproportionate emphasis on the business level and the pursuit of material wealth.
You get exactly what you have in the United States today, which is a collapsed society. If you study Oswald Spengler, who I recommend, he talks about the cycle of empires. And he goes through the four main historical empires and shows that every empire has a spring, a summer, a fall, and a winter. The United States is now in winter. And anybody who can't see that is a dope that the United States is a failing society now. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just look at all the statistics. $35 trillion in debt. Nothing like that has ever happened before in human history. There's no way to pay that debt. And I'll tell you something else. It's not just the United States that it's in debt. The global debt is stratospheric. The whole world is deeply in debt. It's crazy. So it's a very dark situation globally. China is doing very badly. The European Union is falling apart. Look at Russia. Really, they have oil and that's about it. It's an ugly picture globally. I know a lot about this because I'm an investor. So it's my job to know about this. So in order for me to decide what stocks to buy and when, or what precious metals to buy and when, I have to study these things. And I do every day. This is a serious situation. The United States deficit is far greater than its GDP, which is just crazy. They're spending more money than they create. That's just psychotic.
How do you think these factors will impact the stability and long-term sustainability of American society, European society?
And just look at the United States or the UK and you'll see it. Look at what's going on in France. The whole of Western civilization is collapsing. It's a global catastrophe. It's already happening. It's a question of which expert you listen to. For example, some experts say gold is at an all-time high. You probably know that. Some experts say it'll peak at $4,800. Okay? That's twice what it is now. Another expert said if you take all the global debt and divide it by the amount of gold in the world, it works out to $40,000 an ounce. That's the true value of gold. It's a question of who you listen to. Some people say the bubble we're in is not going to collapse yet. So you can say, okay, I'll stay in the market. So there are a lot of details. And being an investor is about details. If you talk to somebody who doesn't really know about investing, they talk in generalities. Oh, the market is down. I just ignore that completely. I want to know about what about this stock? I just sold stock today for profit. The market is still more or less going up. Is there instability? Yes. A lot of people say the United States has been in a depression for years now, and the media and the government cover it up because it's not politically expedient to admit it. But food is 30% more expensive now than it was 3.5 years ago. So that just kills the low and middle class people. They have enough money to buy food, pay the rent, put gas in the car, make the car payments. That's how much money they have, okay? And when you raise the price of food by 30%, that's a catastrophe. So the last I heard, 32% of the people in the United States are skipping meals because they don't have the money for food, okay? So the instability is here. It's happening. And the United States has been spiraling down ever since. Now, the reason I say spiral, a spiral is not a line. It goes around. So yes, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. But the general trend, if you study it, as I do, it's been spiraling down for 60 years. Jack Kennedy was about to pull us out of Vietnam, was making peace overtures with the Soviet Union. The aerospace industry was not going to let that happen. He actually ordered the Treasury to print their own money. The international bankers don't want that. That's why we have the Federal Reserve. They get a percentage of the money. The Americans pay interest on their own cash instead of just doing what they did until 1913, which was we make our own money. There were a variety of things that went on. Jack's brother, Bobby, was even more scrupulous than Jack. He went after the mafia. The mafia had been tied to the federal government since 1940. And in fact, the mafia helped Jack Kennedy win the election. Sam Giancana, the head of the mafia in Chicago, fixed the election so that Kennedy narrowly won the state of Illinois with dead voters, fictitious voters, and so forth. If the mafia had not intervened, he would have lost and Nixon would have been president. Joe Kennedy, who himself was a bootlegger, made a deal with his friends. But the deal was, we'll fix this and make your son president, and then you leave us alone. That's a reasonable deal to make. Then Bobby comes in as attorney general and went after them. The mafia wasn't going to stand for that. So the mafia was part of the conspiracy to kill Jack Kennedy. So they wanted him gone. And of course, they killed Bobby too, a little bit later.
Wow. I always aim to encourage critical thinking and promote the exploration of causal relationships to shed light on the nuanced dynamics that really shape these scales. And I was wondering at level one, why is the realm of philosophy considered the starting point for the emergence and evolution of a civilization?
First of all, whether or not you consider it, it is. That is the point of these scales. Scholars like myself who study the Western tradition, we go back to the Greeks and we study Pythagoras, all these brilliant people who left writings. Socrates didn't leave any writings, but his student, Plato, wrote the Socratic dialogues, which tell us all about Socrates. So we know who Socrates is because of his student Plato writing these many Socratic dialogues. It is factually the beginning of civilization. This is not a secret. All of us intellectuals, for thousands of years now, we go back to the ancient Greeks. The Romans pretty much accepted the whole Greek philosophy. That's why there's such a thing as Greco-Roman civilization. The Greek gods and the Roman gods are only different in that their names are different. Venus and Aphrodite are the same person. And it's patently obvious if you read the literature. It's not subtle. At the time of Jesus, all educated people spoke Greek and Roman. Latin is the actual name of it. Greek and Latin. And that continued until very recently. Thomas Jefferson read Greek and Latin in the original. That's pretty recent. It's only in recent years that the Western tradition has decayed because the globalist fascists who are trying to bring about a global totalitarian government know that if you study all these brilliant men, you start getting ideas. They don't want that. That's why the United States education system has been in a steady downward spiral since they killed Jack Kennedy. All of these collapses go back to that. Look at civilization from a polymathic point of view. This scale is not hard to see. This is what you get. If you study history over and over, you see how these things, for example, in studying the Old Testament, they had the religion and then the law came from the Torah. Jewish law came from their religion. The Jews were different from most people in their day in that they were much more literate. So they had culture. You can see this developing in bits and pieces. And I'm the person who said, if you connect all these bits and pieces, we can see this rung of the ladder here. We can see that rung of the ladder there. If you put all these rungs together, we get this scale. And to me, all the scales seem patently obvious in the same way that the three laws of motion that Newton gave us seem patently obvious to every physicist. Any questions?
This comprehensive scale provides a valuable lens for understanding the complex and multifaceted nature of civilizational development. I found there's so much in this in terms of the examination of the interplay and the relative importance of these 7 levels. One can gain insight into the strengths and the weaknesses and the transformation of societies throughout history. And thank you for that resource, Oswald Spengler. I also see there are many nuances in this. What I'm seeing in the UK is a sense of nostalgia. There's either a reflection that happens or a resentment or acceptance. That can lead to different outcomes depending on whether it's accompanied by reflective awareness, because if nostalgia is unexamined, it can foster resentment or the feeling for that longing for an idealized past. That can lead to dissatisfaction with the present. But if nostalgia is balanced with reflection, it can result in acceptance or creative engagement with the present when one recognizes one's past values but doesn't expect its return. But if you get resentment plus or minus empathy, that can lead to rage or resolution. If it moves towards empathy, that can soften resentment. I'm just thinking about how that can be redirected towards resolution. There can be attempts to have the conversations, open, uncensored, unbiased conversation that lead to sustainable practices that address perceived grievances constructively through dialogue, through reform, through mediation. Because if rage is one of the principal actors in this play, which is what we've seen, plus or minus ideological framing, then we're going to go into fundamentalism or constructive change. When rage meets a rigid ideological framework, that translates into fundamentalism. If that rage is channeled into dogmatic or simplistic ideologies, then it will impose order through its absolute, resulting in a fundamentalist mindset. But if rage is moderated by critical thought, then it can fuel constructive change. Those revolutionary actions can be directed towards reform, justice, fairness, morality, and meaningful progress as distinct from destruction. It's something I'm getting from this scale, and what I'm trying to do is translate it into what is happening today, especially in the UK. If there is fundamentalism plus or minus rebellion, then move into revolution or stagnation. Without fundamentalism, without resistance or intellectual challenge, can only lead to an inevitable spiral towards revolution. If there is no self-critical awareness, then that fundamentalism, as I'm seeing today, is hardening into an authoritarian, rigid ideologies, which, as we've seen in history, often provokes revolution as the system breaks down under its weight. But if fundamentalism can be tempered and the paths that we can open towards reform as distinct from stagnation, then that internal restructuring can avert outright revolution.
And I think the comparison between the American Revolution and the French Revolution is the key to the dichotomy you just articulated. In the United States, we had a revolution, but once it was over, everybody settled down. We didn't go around killing people. It was a military conflict. But in France, it just went crazy. Thousands of perfectly innocent people were beheaded. Rage manifested. The American Revolution was dominated by intellectuals like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Thomas Paine. These were philosophers. They reasoned. We have their writings. I find the teachings of Thomas Paine absolutely acceptable to me. If I had to pick one person to represent me, it would be Thomas Paine. He was the father of the American Revolution. It was all reason and logic. It's not about rage.
He was guided by vision and not by chaos. Without vision, it will tend towards apocalypse, collapse, or destructive chaos, where the whole societal structure will fail entirely. But if there's a visionary revolution, one driven by clear goals, tempered by wisdom and empathy, then that can lead to transformation. So it's a fundamental but constructive reordering, if that's the right term, of society.
Which is why in the United States, we got the first democracy in the world. By about 90 years later, there were about 5 democracies, and now there are hundreds. It all came from the United States, and the United States came from the founding fathers, who were very careful, thoughtful, intelligent persons. So having a revolution guided by Washington and Franklin is completely different from a revolution guided by Robespierre. What did the French Revolution give us? Napoleon. That's what it led to. And then all of the kings of Europe said, we're not going to put up with this. They all got together, defeated him, and brought back with a heavy hand authoritarianism in Europe. What do you think Make America Great Again is? That's what the revolution in the United States is being fought over. It is a form of a civil war. It's just the weapons are different. For example, today, X was shut down in Brazil. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
They shut it down. So Elon Musk, who is an unapologetic spokesman for free speech, We're not going to have free speech. They had a guy who was arrested in France recently who had an internet service. We're not going to allow this. I've run into people on the internet, the idea of free speech. Absolutely not. It's in the First Amendment. The founding fathers put it in there. John Adams wrote the original 12 amendments. That's what founders demanded. We're going to have a country like this. We want freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. That's all going away now. What you're seeing now in the United States is many very powerful people are joining forces. People who were political opponents. Donald Trump used to be a Democrat. He's now joined by Robert F. Kennedy, who was a Democrat. They're both joined by Tucker Carlson, who's considered conservative. They're joined by Tulsi Gabbard, who is a Democratic representative. I just saw yesterday another senator from California, state senator, quit the party and became Republican. So this is an upheaval. It's a civil war that's going on. Now, they tried to kill Trump a couple of months ago, and they didn't succeed. I'm sure there are a lot of people who are unhappy that he was not killed. That's civil war, which is what you get when a civilization collapses. So you've got something like, nobody really knows, something like 15 million illegals, unknown illegals who come into the United States in the last 3.5 years. Many are from countries that are enemies of the United States. These are just not poor people from Mexico. There's thousands of them from China, thousands of them from Syria, and all these Islamic countries. At some point, they're going to start blowing up buildings and things like that. It's not like it hasn't happened already. That's a very serious situation. It all goes back to killing JFK. JFK was somebody that had to be gotten rid of. He was smart, principled, educated, and forceful. Can't allow that. This guy's got to go. And he went. And they went out of their way to do it on TV in broad daylight in front of the whole country as a message to say, if you fool with us, this is what happens.